Hello, my name is Miss Jones. I teach elementary school math, and welcome to my channel, Miss Math Jones. Today we're going to be working on our third grade Eureka Module 5, Lesson 5 homework. The objective for the homework is to recognize that equal parts of an identical rectangle can have different shapes. Let's take a look at number 1. Number 1 says to partition the rectangles in two different ways to show equal shares. So we're going to look at A. Now, A asks us to partition or divide. The word partition means to divide the rectangles into two different ways to show equal shares. So we're going to divide these two rectangles into halves. All right, so halves is the only word form of the fraction that doesn't sound like the number of pieces that you have to divide it into. So for halves, you know how to cut something in half, right? You just chop it in half straight down the middle. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to partition these shapes into halves. So first I'm going to use a vertical line, a line that goes straight up and down, right? And I know that these are two halves because I have half of the shape now on one side of the line and half of the shape now on the other side of the line. Now let's go ahead and partition or divide the second rectangle in a different way because it says that we have to do it in two different ways. So this is the first way. And now for the second way, I'm going to use a horizontal line or a line that goes from side to side. And now I have half of my rectangle below my line and half of my rectangle above my line. So now I've partitioned these two rectangles in two different ways to show two halves. Now, if you need to go ahead and pause your video, go ahead and do so now so that you can go ahead and create these lines to partition your rectangles into two halves. Now let's take a look at B. B asks us to partition these two rectangles into 3/3. All right, so thirds mean that we should have three pieces or three equal parts or three equal shares. So let's go ahead and partition this first rectangle into thirds. And I'm going to use vertical lines. Now notice, even though we are partitioning or dividing it into thirds, we only need two lines to do that. So now we're going to go ahead and partition the second rectangle into 3/3. And I'm going to use horizontal lines this time. So if I use two vertical lines, then how many horizontal lines do you think I'm going to be using? If you said two, you're absolutely right. So we're going to use two horizontal lines, and now we have 3/3. Now, if you need to pause your video to make sure that you have your lines on your rectangles correctly, go ahead and do so now. Now we're moving on to letter C. C says to partition these two rectangles two different ways into 4/4. So I used one line in letter A to partition in halves. I used two lines in letter B to partition it into thirds. So how many lines are we going to use to partition it into fourths? Well, if you said three, you're absolutely correct. I'm going to use three lines to partition these two rectangles into fourths. All right, let's go ahead and create my first line here. Then my second line and my third line. I've used three lines to partition this rectangle into fourths or four equal shares. Now let's go ahead and use three lines to partition the second rectangle into fourths. That's my first line. Here's my second line. And there's my third line. I used three lines to partition this rectangle into 4/4. Now, if you need to go ahead and pause your video so that you can make sure that your rectangles are partitioned correctly, go ahead and do so now. Let's take a look at letter D. Now, if you notice, letter D, E, and F, instead of rectangles, we now have squares. Now, even though they're smaller, you still can use the same methods or the same ways to partition or divide these rectangles into the different fraction types. So, letter D says to partition it into 2 halves. So we're going to do it the exact same way that we did for A. We're going to use one vertical line for the first one and one horizontal line for the second one. Either way, to divide these 2 squares into halves, we only need one line, straight down the middle. And now we have half on one side of the line and half on the other side of the line. Let's move on to E. For E, we want to divide these squares into 3/3. For thirds, we're still going to use 2 lines. So let's go ahead and create 2 lines on the first square. We have 3/3 there. And now I'm going to create 2 horizontal lines on the second square. And still, we've created 3/3. Now let's move on to F. F wants us to partition these squares into fourths, 4/4 to be exact. Now, again, I used one line to divide my squares into halves. I used 2 lines to divide my squares into thirds. And that means I'm going to use 3 lines to divide my squares into fourths. So let's go ahead and divide our squares into fourths. That's 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines. And my first square is now partitioned or divided into 4/4. Now I'm going to use 3 lines to partition my second square into fourths. Here's my first line and my second line and now my third line. As you can see, I have 4 sections that are the exact same size or equal shares. Now, if you need to go ahead and pause your video to make sure that all of your squares are partitioned correctly, go ahead and do so now. Now let's take a look at number 2. For number 2, you're going to have to cut out the square at the bottom of this page. It's a little square at the bottom of the page in the lower right-hand corner. So first it asks you to cut the square in half to make 2 equal size rectangles. Okay, so let's cut it in half. So that means you should be cutting it right down the middle, just like that. Now, if you cut it in half, right down the middle, you're going to end up with 2 equal size rectangles. And then you're going to shade 1/2 with your pencil. So if you look at the screen now, I have one side that's shaded a little bit, so really light blue. And we're going to shade it with our pencil. Now, letter B says to rearrange the halves to create a new rectangle with no gaps or overlaps. Okay, so at this point, it should be cut in half, right? Half of it should be shaded. And then you're going to end up with 2 rectangles, just like that, right? So it's cut in half, one shaded, one's not. You have them in front of you, just laying down. Now we need to rearrange that so that we have 2 rectangles that make a new rectangle, right? With no gaps, no overlaps, which means they have to be touching. So let's do that now. How could we do that? Well, when I do it, mine's going to look something like this. Okay, so mine's look like that. All right, I just stacked them, stacked it right on top of each other. Now, we've done A. We cut the square in half to make 2 equal size rectangles. We shaded 1/2 using our pencil, which I used my computer screen. Then B says to rearrange the halves to create a new rectangle with no gaps or overlaps. Okay, I've done that. Now for C, C says to cut each equal part in half to make 4 equal size squares. Now you might want to pause the video so that you can cut yours in half, but when you cut them, you should be cutting about here on both. So go ahead and pause the video so that you can cut your rectangles now in half. So when you cut those rectangles in half, you should end up with 4 squares. So go ahead and pause your video so that you can cut your rectangles in half. Okay, now you should have 4 squares. All right, so it says rearrange the new equal squares to create different polygons. So you can rearrange them now any way that you'd like. Then it says draw one of your polygons from part D below, 1/2 is shaded. So for that, what I just did was I just made a really skinny, long rectangle, and I put my 2 shaded ones on top and the 2 squares that were not shaded on the bottom. Now you can either draw it on your homework or you can glue down the squares that you have and just kind of get creative. But I just made like a tall, skinny rectangle. And if you have something that looks like this, that's fine. Now, once you do that, then that means you finished everything because this was the last question of this particular homework. So, you know what that means. Lesson 5 homework is complete. Congratulations, you've completed this homework. It actually was pretty short, but I'm very, very glad you made sure to complete your homework correctly. Now, as always, I hope this video helped. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Bye.